working off guard. I did a session last week, but I'm back this week to expand on Einstein Analytics. So I am a Einstein Analytics solution architect with Salesforce, and I work for what we call the ACE team, so Analytics Center of Excellence. Also a user group leader here in London, and I blog regularly on salesforceblogger.com. So if any of this that I'm talking about today or even last time is interesting, feel free to go in there and learn more. I'm putting quite a few how-to things up there. If you want to follow me on Twitter, my handle is right there. But other than that, I think let's just get started. So I'm deviating a little bit from the agenda that was put out. So first of all, I'm going to go through the data side of things and just explain a few things around that. But then go into some SAQL examples. And instead of actually doing a SOQL example that I showed or that I put into the agenda originally, I thought in winter 19 we actually released a time series, which is using different models to predict what's going to happen in the future with our data. So I thought that was a little bit more interesting to do a dive into, so I'm going to do that. But I will look at, just give you a few tips on different steps that you can be using in Einstein Analytics, and then moving into some bindings, which also is quite nice to know how you can use. As I am working for Salesforce, I do have to show you a forward-looking statement slide. I'm sure you've seen it before, sure you're going to see it again. But basically, if you're looking to make any purchasing decision, please make those decisions on what is currently available in the system. Pretty sure whatever I'm showing you today is already available in the winter release, so shouldn't worry too much about this. Now, last week we tried to create a data set, and this data set, we were getting our data from Salesforce, right? And we're taking this data and we're bringing it into Einstein Analytics. So last week we were talking a little bit why this is actually relevant. That is relevant for the search capabilities that we are applying, and a lot of other things. However, so how does this actually work from a data side? How do we actually work with this data layer? So you may have heard there is something called sync or connections. Previously it was called replication, but this has been changed in the winter release. So I may say replications a few times now, but hopefully you know what I mean, what I'm referring to. So this is a setting within Einstein Analytics. It's a settings that you're doing under settings in the back end of Salesforce. So whenever you go in to set up in Salesforce and you search for analytics, there is a setting there that is connections and sync. If you enable that, you do get a cache-free layer. Now, if you don't, what we're doing, and every time we're pulling in our data from Salesforce in the data flow, we're going to look at this here. This is where we don't have any data sync set up. So every time we're running our data flow to generate our data sets here, what we're actually doing is we're taking those, we're doing extract directly from our Salesforce object. So that can be a little bit slow because we have to extract, we have to do our transformation, and then we register this as a data set. Now, if we are enabling this sync or connections, what actually happens is what you see here on your right. So instead of actually taking objects directly from Salesforce, we're putting in this cache-free layer where we are taking the objects that you need, the fields that you need from Salesforce, we're putting them into this layer. And that also means that when you're running your data flow, you don't have to do a full extract every time. For your Salesforce data, this is going to be incremental updates. So what this basically means is whenever you're running your data flow, it becomes a lot faster. Um, Also, there are some other benefits from enabling this. You get some free connectors that you can leverage. So basically, by setting up your username, your password, and maybe some different keys, you're actually going to get access to external data. So it's a quick way of integrating data from other platforms. I'm not going to show you too much around that, but there's a lot of different connectors, and they've really been coming in the past year and a half, I think. So if you're interested in that, please have a look at the documentation to see what kind of connectors that are supported. Generally, they're going to be cloud-based connectors. Another thing, there's also a benefit here is when we're enabling this layer, we actually get we get a lot more data flows that we can use. So we're not just stuck with one, where if we don't have any cache-free layer or the connection enabled, we do just have one single data flow, and over here we can have multiple. Now, if we're looking at how does this landscape work when we're enabling these connections. So as you can see here we have all our different data where we can look at our standard Salesforce object. We can also use other Salesforce orgs, Marketing Cloud, Redshift, or any of the other connectors that we're doing. Basically, these are being put into this connect layer that I was just talking about. And any of these data sources we can use in the data flow and the data set builder to actually generate and register our data set here. Now, we can also pull in CSV file. We saw that last week, where you can actually take your file and you register your data set directly. That goes outside of your replication, your connections. And also it's possible to import or to establish a connection to other databases using some of the standard middleware tools. So if you're using MuleSoft, Jitterbit, Informatica, any of that, you're able to kind of pull it over as a data set as well. All the different data sets that you have here, they are actually, they can be reused in a data flow to generate new data sets, or we can take some of this information. We can also use data recipes to do some transformations and register as a data set. So these are kind of the different, this is kind of the landscape of the data side and how that works. Now let's talk a little bit about what is data flow and recipes. So data flow is data flow and recipes are both the tools in the data manager that we can use to take our data, to transform our data, and then afterwards register that data into data sets. And then we can, once we have the data set, we can of course explore our data. Now, recipes are what we say is really accessible. That's what I tend to use for the simple cases, and also where you may not be that technical. The UI is very friendly, and it's kind of easy to get an overview of what it's possible to do in here. Now, the data flow is a little bit different. It works a little bit different than your recipes. And this is kind of what we've been working with all along, where recipes is like a newer addition to the data transformation. But data flows can be a little bit more difficult to get your hands on, or at least like understand. But they are really, really powerful. So depending on kind of your use case, you would go either or depending on the uses that you're working with. That's kind of how I work with it anyway. Now, you can do a lot of things, and I just put one example in here that I was going to try and do today with creating a compute expression in a data flow. Just to kind of give you an example. I'm not going to go through the recipe part just because it is very user-friendly, and I feel like most people would be able to go in there and kind of like navigate around and try a few different things, where the compute or with the data flow becomes a little bit more, oh, where do I look and what does everything mean? So that I decided to kind of spend some time on that instead. Just as last week, I tried to put in some references. So if you want to try out what I am going to show, here's a link for you to try that out. But let's try and go in to Einstein Analytics. So this is Analytics Studio that we were looking at last week. Now up here in the gear icon, I can actually go ahead and I can navigate to my data manager. So anything that has to do with your data, you should be able to find in here in the data manager. Now, the first thing we go into is this like log. So this is where you can see everything that has happened within your org. You can see here we have different kinds of replication that has been that has run. We can see I've uploaded a CSV file and so forth. We've also run the default data flow earlier today. Now, in here, you'll see there's a couple of different menus. The data flow and recipes. So this is the existing data flow. So I have 3 data flows in this org. And I also have 1 recipe in here. So these are kind of the 2 different things that I can switch between here. Now the data is just like an overview of all my different data sets. So you can see this is just an overview. Should you want to explore, I would still go and do that within the Analytics Studio. But this is a good way to kind of get all your data together. And then finally, you can see here the connect. This is that cache-free layer I was talking about. You can see all of them are green. That means everything is all good. However, I just want to highlight you are supposed to schedule this. Now, this is the developer works. I haven't actually scheduled it, but just make sure that your replication or your connections run first, then your data flow, and then your recipes if your recipes are based on anything that your data flow is going to use. So there is that kind of like step-by-step that we need to follow. Now let's go ahead and go back up to our data flow. The one I'm going to look at is going to be my default data flow here today. And this is basically the data flow, how it actually looks. So you can see I already have a different nodes. So each one of these are going to be called nodes. And each of them is doing different things. So you can see this is a SFDC digest. We have an augment. We have a register. I think there's a few different ones in here. Pretty much, mostly. Well, actually, it's just augments, register, and digest. If you scroll down here, you'll see I have another data flow or another component to my data flow, which is a lot more simple. So I thought let's go ahead and look at this one today. Now, up here, you'll see here the different transformations that we can do within Einstein Analytics. The typical one you're going to look at is this SFDC digest. So that is when we're bringing any data that is Salesforce related. We can also bring data from other connections. That would be a digest, or an edge mark that would be already registered data sets. We can do appends, we can do augments. Augments is kind of like a lookup. We can do compute expression, compute relative, dim to measure. So these are different like transformation options. You can do filter. You can slice your data set. And then one thing here that is really, really important is that we can register our data set. If there is no register node, we don't actually see a data set, because this is what actually determines that now we're creating that data set that we can use in Analytics Studio. So if we're looking at this here, what we're actually doing here is we're taking an opportunity. So that is our root object in this instance. We're taking that, and that is the Salesforce digest. We're also taking out account information, and then we're doing a lookup between the two of them, and then adding some account information into our opportunity. We're also taking our user information, and we're doing the same. We're adding some information about the user to our opportunity and account. Then finally here, you'll see that we're registering this, and we're registering that into Salesforce, so we can now start exploring it. Now let's say I want to do some further transformation. I want to, let's say I want to look at at creating a new field. Just before I do that, let me just illustrate a purpose here. I do think I have the data set here somewhere in my ops data. So let's just say count of rows, and we are doing a grouping on stage, and also we are looking to do let's say a waterfall. Now what you'll probably notice here is it starts with closed loss, closed won, and needs analysis. And as we're used to with our stages, they go through a specific order. And we don't really have this order here because we're looking at alphabetically order. And that's wrong in this instance. The way we can do that is if we're adding a 01, 02, 03, then the order starts becoming correct. Now, I'm not going to show this in the end, but I can get rid of that 01, 02 by going into fields, and I can start changing the labels. This is what we're calling the XMD. Okay, so let me just go back into the data manager, and let's have a look at that compute expression. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new compute expression. Before you do that, it's very important to just kind of notice, oh, okay, the source for this new node that we're creating is going to be the augment user. So I'm going to click here, and I'm going to say this is just going to be my compute expression, and the source is going to be my augment user. And now I'm ready here to add my field. So the first thing I want to do is just going to call this something. So I'm going to say stage sort. And just as we have formula fields in Salesforce, we can then start defining what type of output are we expecting. In this case, I am expecting a text because it's a stage. So I'm just going to keep the type as is. Now, in terms of my SAQL expression, I did a little prep. And instead of me actually having to type everything out, I just kind of did it here because you can see it's quite long, so it's taking me a little bit of while. But what we're doing is we're using a case statement and saying, well, when stage name equals prospecting, then give me output of 01 prospecting. When stage name equals qualification, then return 02 qualification, and so forth. Notice we down here have else 11 other, and then we're just putting an end. So this is the syntax. I'm going to copy this. Very important to know that this is case sensitive, and it doesn't like having line splits either. So just make sure it's one line. Now, I don't tend to put anything in default value when I'm using case statements because frankly, we're already considering that with the else part of the statement. So in this case, I'm just going to click save and also click create. Just before I click create, note I can add actually more fields. So if I wanted to create multiple new fields within the same node, I can definitely do that. But I'm just going to click on create. And you can now see I have this new expression here, or this new node here that is just kind of like, you know, doesn't have anything after it. What that's actually mean is that now I've created my compute expression. It's happening as part of my data flow, but it's actually not part of my actual data set because the register is tied to my user or my augment part here. So what I want to do is I want to click on this arrow next to it. Be careful because if you click here, you see there's a trash can and then you'll delete instead. So we don't want to do that. But we are going to click here and we're going to drag it up to my register. And you can now see that that link has been removed between the augment user and been replaced between the compute expression and the register. So I can go ahead now, click upload. Whoops, I'm starting to see some things here I don't want to see. There we go. So we can click on update data flow. There we go. And then we also have to run it. Now, do remember when we're working with this that you do want to take backups, which you can do here, just because we don't have anything, we don't have an undo, so you don't just want to make sure that you're can revert back to where you came from if you're doing more complex things. But that's basically what it takes to create a compute expression within Einstein Analytics and the data flow. So let me just go back to the slides. Okay, so leaving the data flow and the data side behind, let's move into some of the things in the design layer that's a little bit more technical. So what we can actually, what we're looking at here is, imagine this up here is a dashboard, right? So this here is a dashboard. Now there's different elements to it. There's the one that we did last week where we just, created a chart. We had a step, we had sum of amount maybe, and we grouped by stage, just as we just did a few minutes ago. Now what is important to know is underneath we have a JSON file. We have the dashboard JSON. Now this dashboard JSON consists of the visual display, the chart properties, the chart type and the properties, and then it also has security. So this is what we call in the compact format. But sometimes we want to do something that is a little bit more advanced. So we can have still a chart here, but underneath we have a different step type that is powered by the SAQL, okay? Now, we can sometimes also have step types here that are powered by data directly from within Salesforce. So it's going to be your SOQL or your Apex steps. Now, everything else here, that's going to be powered by data sets that we're creating in the data flow. And on top of that, we have that XMD. The XMD is where we can go in and we can actually, as I said before, we can modify the visual display. So we can modify, well, we called it 01 prospecting, but we just want the end user to see prospecting. So we can actually, in the XMD, remove it from the, just remove the 01 and the end user sees something that makes a little bit more sense to them, but we're keeping that sorting that we really want. Now, we in summary introduced, notice up here, in summary introduced conditional formatting, and that actually enable us to have one more thing that is called the asset XMD. This one is right now only accessible through API, but the XMD down here is fully UI friendly, so you can go in by that fields that I clicked on, and basically all the options of the XMD is in there. Okay, so what is SAQL? So SAQL is Salesforce Analytics Query Language, and that is what the engine uses at runtime. So what we talked about before, let me just go one slide back. This one here that is called compact format. Before the engine actually reads it, it actually is converted into SAQL. So sometimes it makes sense for us to overwrite that and just write it straight in SAQL. The times where it makes sense is when you want to do something that is a little bit more, there's a little bit more complexity to it. Generally, I would always, that's just my preference, I start out building as much as I can in the UI, and then I switch over to SAQL if I need it. There are different ways where we can use SAQL. One example is the year-to-date comparison. So when you want to look at how did my opportunities look last year at the same time period as what we have this year till this date. We can also use it when we want to do 2 data sets or 3 data sets within one step. Then there's also this new time series that a little bit more predictions into it. If you want to try it out yourself, I have again just a few blogs that I've written about on this topic. So I'll let it up to you. But other than that, let's just try and create some of these things. So moving over to Einstein Analytics, I can close down my data manager. FYI, if you want to move from data manager into Analytics Studio, the gear icon again should take you right there. I technically already had it open, but let's just wait. Yeah. Okay. So let's take a data set I have down here, which is called my ops data. So this was actually the one that we just updated in the data flow. So it should actually in here have, if my data flow completed successfully, I didn't show that, but you can see here I have my new state sort, so it's actually going to be in here. Now, what I want to do is I want to change my bar. And what I'm going to show you right now is that year-to-date comparison. So I'm just going to choose amount, and I'm going to group by, let's say, industry. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is I want to switch over to my compare table, and I want to have one more sum of amount. So now I have sum of amount, but one of these I want to be current year, so year to date, and the other one I want to be the same time period last year. So the first one here, I need to add a filter. So I'm going to click on this arrow next to it, and I'm going to add a filter. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to choose is the close date. And notice from, I think, again, summer, we actually have all these new filters on date that is a little bit more, you know, user-friendly. It looks like what you also have in standard reporting. If you go down to calendar year, we also have some new ones for in the winter release. So let's use this current year to date, which is basically what we want to use. So this is fine. But the other sum of amount, I need to have a, what's it called? I need to have a filter in this one as well. So I'm going to go in and add a filter, and again, close date. And this time, I'm going to say previous year to date. So this is a little bit wrong, because what I was actually interested in is last year to current, last year to today for last year, right? So the same time period last year, but right now it's looking all the way up to today. So that's not really what I'm interested in. Now, that function didn't really exist, and there's no way for me in the UI to actually say, hey, I want it to be a year ago. So what we can actually do now is we can switch over to SAQL. Now, the way I switch over to SAQL is I have this, this button up here, which switches over to SAQL mode. So this is not really that scary. You can see we're loading our data set. We're filtering one stream, filtering a second stream, we're grouping, and then we're also projecting what we want, and we're then ordering, and we're having a limit on. So pretty straightforward. Does look a little bit different, so if you're not used to it, it can be a little bit confusing the first times. But what I'm interested in is looking at this filter. So notice here, current year to current date. That's fine. That was the first column that we have. The second one is looking a little bit wrong, because it's 1 year ago to current day, and I just wanted it to be current date last year. So what I can do is just say minus 1 year. If I click run, you can now see that my B column has changed, and I can switch back into my chart mode, and there you go. I can start modifying my chart type. Maybe I want to have, actually, maybe I just want to have formatting, and I want to go to the bar chart. Instead of have small multiples, I just want to have one single axis, and there you go. Now, of course, the A and B is wrong, but I can go in and I can modify that in SAQL as well, which would just be down here. Instead of saying sum as, then it could be year to date. Whoops. Year to date last year. Run, and there you go. That's basically how we do it. So this is the first example of SAQL that I was going to show you. The second one was going to look at how can we actually look at two different data sets. So I'm just going to close this down. And in this case, I want to now create a new dashboard. And this is just how I like it, because it's kind of like, instead of me creating everything from scratch and having to remember all the syntax, I tend to kind of copy paste. So let's look at having a combining two data sets. The use case is I want to be able to see how many accounts do we have, and then how many, for each account, how many opportunities do they have? Because if we're looking at my opportunity data set, and if I'm grouping anything there might be some, if I group by, let's say, account name in my opportunities, there will always be an account, right? But in reality, we also have some accounts that do not have any opportunities. But because I'm looking at my opportunity data set, each of the accounts that I mentioned in there will always going to have a opportunity. So we can now look in a SAQL statement to actually join the two different data sets together, and then we would have that view of our accounts and then how many opportunities do they have. So let's go ahead first and create a new step. And in this case, I'm going to do an account. I have my data set here. I'm just going to call this accounts. And I am going to keep count of rows, but I'm going to group this by account name. And then I'm just going to click done. I'm going to add this in so you can see that here is all my accounts. Each of them have a number 1. I'm also going to go in and create a new step with my opportunity data set, which is this one that I want to use. I'm going to call this opti. And here also I'm going to group by account name. Now, just before I save this, I tend to just go in here. Let's take this SAQL, let's copy it, and I'm not going to do anything here. I'm not going to, run it. I just want to switch back, and then I'm going to click done. So all I just wanted to do was just copy the SAQL, so I had that. And let's add it in here. So you can see that some accounts have 1, some have 3, some have 2, and so forth. Okay, so what we want to do now is we want to take this account and we want to clone that. So I'm just going to clone my account step. And in this case, I'm going to call this opti, account with opti. If I can spell. There we go. Cool. So I'm keeping my count of rows, keeping my account name, but what I want to do is I actually just want to switch directly into SAQL, go a few lines down, and I'm pasting in that information or the SAQL I had for my opportunity. Now, I do this, again, just because I don't necessarily remember what is the data set name, what is the API name for this specific field, and so forth. So it's kind of helping me a little bit. But notice up here in Winter, we actually have add new data set. So we can use that function as well. However, for me, it's just, I'm keen to remember all these names. So I don't know, this is just kind of old habit. It was just released. I'm going to take my line 8 and I'm going to copy that and I'm going to delete it. And I'm going to paste it up here in my second line. So now I'm actually loading 2 statements in. However, my second can't be called Q as well, so I'm just going to call it Q1. Now I need to group this. So you can see down here, I already have my group statement of my second data set. So I'm just going to copy that as well. And in my third line, I'm going to put left because I want to do a left join here. And I'm going to put in that statement in here. Now again, can't call it Q, so I'm going to call it Q1 again. And I'm saying group Q, which is coming up here, by name. And group Q, well, that now has to be Q1, so we're going to change that to Q1 by account name. Now, the next thing that I then want to do is I need to start projecting this. So I'm having my for each statement. The first thing is, actually, I'm not going to call this Q1. I'm going to call this final. And this one, I'm also going to call final. And for each Q, so that's for each final, which is looking up here, generate name as name. That's fine, but it doesn't know where it's coming from. So I just have to put Q dot name. And then the other thing that I have to do is I have to say count. And that one I want to be coming from the, what's it called? The account, now account name. So that's what's coming from my opportunity. So here I'm just going to put Q1 in. Here I'm going to final. I'm going to order final by name. That's fine. And limit Actually, we don't want to order by fine. So let's just do this here. Hold on. So count, we're just going to call that instead opti. And we're going to call this opti. And we're going to sort this by descending. Here we go. The final thing is just have final. Well, actually, we don't need this one, so I can just delete that. Oh, my mouse is going a little crazy here. There we go. So now, basically, I've taken what I wanted to take from my statement down here, so I can just go ahead and delete this. But what we're now left with is that we have our load statement to load in our data set from account. We have a load to load in our opportunity. Then we're grouping name from our account with account name from our opportunity. Then we're projecting the name from the account side, because that's what we want to keep. And we're taking how many opportunities do we actually have over here, and we're calling that opti, and then we're ordering final by opti descending. So hopefully that's going to work. So now you can see here that we have all our account names. We can see the number of opportunity have, and we're sorting by this number. So we're starting with Fowler, who has 5. Now we don't need to stick with this view, so we can go over to our chart mode. And you can go ahead and see here's all the different opportunities. Now I could, if I wanted to, of course, go in and set that limit. So we're now saying, hey, I just want to look at top 10 or something like this. But this is just a way to kind of join in and see, okay, we actually have Fowler here with 5 going all the way down. And you'll also notice now that we should have some opportunities all the way in the bottom here, or some accounts that do not have any opportunities. That's kind of the use case. We wanted to have that overview of, hey, do we have any opportunities or any accounts that do not have any opportunities? And we do. So now we can click on done. And you can see here that I now have my account, I have my opportunity, and then we have the one here with multiple data set that we can pull in, and we can see the joined information. And there we go. So that's how we look at 2 different data sets within one step. So the last one I wanted to look at was the time series. I'm just gonna leave this, I don't need to save it. So I uploaded a avocado data set, it has a little bit more data. And here, what I want to do is I want to start looking at what is the volume that we're predicting in terms of the sold avocados. So the first thing I want to do is I want to change my count of rows from count to sum of, we should have a volume here, so total volume. And the next thing I want to do is I want to group by date, and I want to group by year, month. Okay. So now I've done as much as I can in the UI. So I'm going to switch over to my SAQL mode. And there's a few things that I have to do. So right now, I have to start out with, after my grouping, I want to say a new queue equal, and I want to do a for each statement. So for each, spell again, each, that's always the tricky part, is actually the spelling for me. For each queue, generate, and again, I like copy pasting, so I'm just going to copy paste our year and month up here. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I'm going to copy this part of the for each statement in. And there we go. And then I just need to have my semicolon. So the next thing I want to do after I've done this first for each statement is now I want to go in and I want to use a fill statement, because when we're looking at grouping by year, date, year month, there's sometimes scenarios where we may or may not have a date, right? So there might be months where we have no data. And when we're doing the time series function, it will have issues if it's missing some dates. So we can use new for fill statement to actually make sure we're filling out the missing dates. So we're going to put Q equal fill Q by, and then we're going to have 2 parentheses, and I'm just going to end with my semicolon to indicate something is coming up. And what I now want to do is within this one, I want to say date calls, and that's just the syntax, equal, and then 2 parentheses. Now I want to take exactly what we have up here again, the month. So this is just saying like what is this the format of the date that you want in. I do have to put in a comma, and then I just have to say, well, this is a year month. If you had year quarter, you could put YQ in, but just make sure that this is actually the same that you have up here in order for it to make sense. Now, once we have this, we're ready to put in our time series. So we can put Q equals time series, Q generate. And now we're going to take, this is actually the sum of total volume is what we want to project, right? This is what we want to look at, what's predict. We want to predict this one. So we're going to put in sum total value as, I'm going to call it FR casted _vol. So this is now the value we're projecting. And I'm going to put with, and then I'm going to have my parentheses, and I'm going to end with my semicolon. Within this, I first have to say how long is it that I want to predict. In this case, I'm going to put length equal, let's just say 6, and this is going to be months now. I also want to have my date calls equal and my parentheses. And in this case, I'm actually just going to put in exactly what I have up here. So again, I'm just going to copy that in, saying what is the format. And then we can start adding in other values as well. There's prediction interval. There is what model do you want to use. There's a lot of seasonality. This is also another one. So there's a bunch of different parameters that we can add in. They're not all mandatory, so I would recommend you guys to look at the documentation, see what each of the parameters are doing. But for this simple case, I'm just going to stick with the length and the date calls, and that's basically it. So the next thing I then want to look at is then I just want to make sure I have my for each statement generated, or for each Q generate, I want to have that optimized. So the first part here I can keep. I can also keep, I'm actually just deleting this. I don't need to do an aggregation again. I already did that before. But I am missing one thing. I'm missing my, the one I have here, so the forecasted value. So I can actually go in here and say this one, copy. I'm going to put that in here and then paste it. There we go. And I'm keeping my order, keeping my limit, and I can now start running this. You can now see I have my sum of total volume that I had all along, but I also now have my forecasted volume. And if I scroll down and notice, yes, I will still have a prediction for this date, even though I have data. But when you scroll down and you see, okay, I don't have any more data for my forecasted, it gives me 6 months ahead that I told it to do up here. And then basically after that, now it's using the data to predict how much is actually going to happen going forth. So I can switch over to my chart mode. I can switch back to a different chart. So I want to use maybe a timeline here. I can go in here and work with my formatting to say, hey, I want to have single axis. I want to do don't fill area. And then you can start looking at how is the prediction then going to look going forward. So this is basically how we can use time series to look at what's kind of coming ahead. So those were the SAQL statements I wanted to do. So let me just go back to the presentation. As I said, there is also some other steps. Just if we're going back to that slide where it showed you of the dashboard with the JSON as well, and what's happening underneath. Sometimes we want to use real live data, so we want to take the data directly from Salesforce. So that is possible for us to do with SOQL steps. Just be aware that it does have an impact. If you are working with let's say a lot of different data there, it will have an impact on your performance. But a good way to use it is, for instance, if you want to look at who is the logged in user and you want to start filtering some of the data based on the user who is logged in. And I do have an example here of how you can do that. One thing I did forget to mention around the SAQL steps is just remember, if you do that, if you're starting to modify in SAQL, know that once you're doing that, it actually switches the aggregate step that we're using with the compact format I talked about. It actually switches that out to a SAQL step, and that also means that you can now not modify in the UI, and you going forward have to actually modify it in SAQL. So it has an impact on whoever is coming after, and that also means only really use SAQL if it's relevant. If you can do it in the UI, do it in the UI. Okay, so the last thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about was bindings. Bindings is basically a way to link different steps together, or you can link steps with different widgets. So some examples are that dynamic gauge. I'm sure you've seen it in standard Salesforce, where you have a gauge and it says what is the different target breakpoints, and you have to manually go in and put that in. But what if you wanted that to be based on different averages from some data? Well, you can actually do that in Einstein Analytics, calculate the averages, and then bind that result into your gauge, your breakpoint. We can also use it for dynamic groupings, dynamic, yeah, pretty much anything that is dynamic you can do with bindings. Again, just a few different ones. If you want to look at that, making your gates dynamic, this is the first one. Static steps, I'm going to show you one example of that now. But there's a few other ways you can do it, or with a few different components. And then also, if you want to, for instance, toggle between different map types, there is also an example of how you do that here. But let's go into back into Einstein Analytics and have a look at it. So I don't need to save that one, but I do want to create a new dashboard. I'm going to choose a blank dashboard, and for this scenario, I'm going to go in and create a step. I'm going to base it on this one here, and I'm going to do sum of amount, and I'm going to group by account type. Okay, and I'm going to click, sorry, best practice always to give this name, or this step a name. In this case, I'm just going to call it step because it's a very basic dashboard, and I'm just going to have 2 steps on it. So this should be easy to remember. And now I'm going to take my step and I'm going to put it in here to my canvas. Now I want to be able to toggle between showing what is the account type and the account industry. So I'm also going to go ahead and take a toggle here. I'm going to put that up on the top. Now, I can't really create a step that I can put in here just with the data set, because that would have to have 2 groupings, so it doesn't really make sense. But what I can do is I can go in here and create a step, and notice down here I can create a static step, which I'm going to use. I'm going to call this my static. And this is the displays. What is the end user going to see? They're going to see account type, and then what is the API name? That is going to be account ID.type. I just remember this, but you do sometimes want to have to look this up. So again, industry and account ID, ID dot industry, and add it. So these are the field API names, just double checking, looks all good. So now I can click on create, and you'll notice now that I have my static step over here that I can tick and I can drag up here. Now I do have to make sure one of them are selected. The easiest way to do that is select the step or the widget, go to the step section here, and then make sure that the selection type is single required, because there always have to be one grouping. Okay, so now I'm just going to save my dashboard because it's always annoying when it doesn't when it doesn't work and I have to refresh and then I lose everything. So if I've saved it, at least I have that. So APIC hours part 2, and then I'm going to save that. Now what I want to do is I need to go into my the dashboard JSON. I do want to remember those two names, especially the static name and also, well, actually both of them, because I need to start looking for them now. So I'm going to go into my dashboard JSON. I do that in Command E or Control E, depending on Mac or PC. And it has all the different instructions for a data set. So you can see here, there's some things around how is the layout. It also has all the different steps that we have here. So we had the step that we created with the measure of some amount, and we also had the grouping. And we also down here, if we scroll down, we have our static step with the different displays. And I'm going to go up because what I wanted to change was the grouping. So here, I'm going to take this account ID .type, and I'm going to delete it. And this is where I want to put in my my binding. Now my binding has a specific syntax. So it's 2 double quotes, it's 2 double curly brackets, start and end, or double curly brackets, start and end. The first thing I have to always evaluate, is this a result binding or selection binding? The easiest way to say it is, does the end user have to do anything in order for it to react? Then it's a selection binding. If not, it's a result binding. In this case, it is a selection binding because I'm selecting in my toggle. And so I'm going to put in .selection. The other thing that I have to do is, what is it they're selecting from? That was from the static step, which was called static _1. Now I'm putting this in parentheses, and then I need to define what type is it. Do I want to look at a single cell, or do I want to take the whole column? In this case, I'm taking the whole column, and I want this to be an array of information then. So I'm going to put as object, and then I have a start and end parenthesis. In here, I just have to do a comma, and then I have to define what is the column that I want. This is an array of information, so I'm going to have, I'm going to do something like this, having my array. I'm going to have my escaped quotations, and then I'm going to put in value because that was the name of the column that we had down here, right here. Okay, so this should hopefully work. I always have a tendency of copying everything just so I have it in case. So I'm going to click done, and I'm going to click preview. Now you'll notice now that it doesn't work. Well, why? Because in spring, I believe, we introduced something called column map, and that's actually controlling the order of how things are viewed on your chart. And we don't really want that when we're binding. So you see here we have this column map. I'm going to take from the start curly bracket down to the end, and I'm just going to say no because I don't need to use this function when I'm using bindings. Now this part is also part of my widget, the visual display. So I'm going to go down to this one, and I know this is the right one because down here it also have a name to the step somewhere. Now this is very basic, but it should have a step reference that is referencing up to the step that I used before, but I know I only have one chart, so that's why I know this is the right one. So here you can see I have my column map. I'm going to take that one as well and put null. Click done. And now you should see that I can change between account type and account industry. Now I do want to tell you one thing. This is a lot of like different things to cover. You can go in and create a new app. Instead of taking from blank, you're starting from a template. And then notice we actually have this one. This used to be an App Exchange package you'd have to install, but with Winter it's actually in as a template. So you click on this Learning Adventure, you go through the process of installing that. You see Astro skipping, which is my favorite part. And then you get an app like this, where you can go in and run it, and it will give you examples how to actually build dynamic apps. So for instance, here I can go in, I can say, well, if I want to have a dynamic grouping, what we just did, you can see here, here's the goal, here's an example. And it says what are the steps that you have to go through here. It gives you the code and explains what the code means. With same thing, if you go back, you'll see that we also have it for SAQL and also how to actually evaluate which chart is the right one. So please go ahead and install this and play around with it and see the different options that you can do. It's supposed to be a really good help, and you know, I use it sometimes as well. Just, hey, what was the syntax here? Because I don't remember everything by heart. So definitely something I can recommend you guys to install. Now, that was basically all that I had prepped for today, and I think that was pretty good timing, to be honest. There's 1 minute left. So if there's, sorry, this was actually, I think I should have deleted this. This was a link for today, but I still want to highlight the link that I also shared last week. If you want to kind of embark on your Einstein Analytics journey, I wrote a blog on this here. It has a lot of different tips and tricks and recommendations and yeah, just references to other material that you might find interesting. Just to highlight, to remember that you guys should install the Learning Adventure app that I just showed you. Absolutely brilliant and amazing. And that was basically it. Yeah. Any questions?
Thank you so much for the great session, Rekti. And guys, if you have any question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question.
That was a lot of stuff.
Even I'm not able to see any question on the chat. And okay, if we don't have any question, then we will stop recording, and I will post this recording on the YouTube. So if you want to review the same recording again, you can go back to our YouTube channel, Salesforce Apeksha Hour, and you can see the recording again. Thank you everyone for the joining, and thank you so much, Rika, for the great session on the Einstein Analytics. And thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.